about the study, and I hope by now you've had a chance at least to review portions of it. My goal for tonight are to talk about some of the major findings and recommendations, and then talk about next steps and answer any questions that you might have about the study.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry to interrupt.
Sure, Trustee Warren.
Just point of order, are we asking questions as we go, or do we want to just save them till the end? I'm okay either way. Just want to make sure that I just want to make sure we put in place a procedure.
Mr. Weiss, how would you like us to do
it? It doesn't really make much difference to me. If you want to stop and ask questions, sometimes the question might be answered later in the discussion, in which time I might just ask you to hold on, if that's okay.
Okay. How about this? Unless it's a real pressing question or really pertinent to what's up on the screen, try to jot them down and we'll take questions at the end.
Sounds good.
Okay.
I'll accept them during the presentation, but again, let's try to hold most of them. Okay.
Terrific. All right, so let me start out by first talking a little bit about crime in Shorewood. This is data from the Uniform Crime Report. This is the system that the FBI has maintained for almost 100 years now, where they collect crime data from every city. There's some problems with UCR data, but the main advantage of it is that it's really uniform across the country and they have some fairly common definitions. So what this shows is clearly Shorewood's a very safe place. Only a few violent crimes, 28 burglaries over the course of the year, 168 larcenies, but those include bicycle thefts and shoplifting, you know, lots of everyday kind of crimes. Interestingly enough, in spite of the fact that everybody talked about motor vehicle theft being a problem, there were only 10 in 2019. If it was your car, it was a problem, but we got the impression from talking to people that it was a much bigger issue. So a total of 230 what we call Part 1 crimes, and these are crimes that are reported to the police. What you see in the next column are the arrests for those crimes and the percentage. For example, they had 7 robberies and 2 of them were cleared by arrest, 16 aggravated assaults and 11 cleared by arrest, and so forth. The most problematic one, I believe, is the burglary one, where they only cleared 2 out of the 28. That's an area that probably needs some additional attention. For the most part, however, though, these kinds of arrest and clearance rates are comparable to other agencies in the Midwest. I think, once again, I think the burglary number is a little bit problematic. Tonight, we're going to talk a lot about calls for service. And during the preparation of this study and in our discussions, there's been a lot of, if you will, debate about this. In all the studies that we do, we look for what are called community-generated calls for service. And that is defined as a case in which someone calls the communication center, typically on 911, and asks for the police, and then the police are dispatched. And what we do is we allocate time between calls that come from the community like that and other activities. So when we first worked with the police department, and we identified we identified about 5,560 calls that looked like community-generated calls. But we use an interesting kind of, another way to define it. We looked for calls in which the receive time and the dispatch time and the arrive time are all the same. I mean, the same to the second. This to me would indicate that these were not actually dispatch calls. They were calls that either officers came upon. In some cases, they were calls in which someone came into the station and then an officer came in and did a report and needed a number, but they don't meet the classical definition of community generated. And in a moment, you'll see why that's a critical distinction. The police department, pushed back pretty hard about this. And we're not saying that these calls didn't happen. We're just saying they came in a different way. The truth of the matter is, though, if it's 44-44 or 55-60, you're talking about the difference of about 3 calls per day spread out over 7 officers over the course of the day. So it's not a significant difference. Now, in terms of the magnitude, on the days when 7 officers work, which is fairly typical in
Yes.
we would expect about each officer to handle about 2 calls per 8-hour shift. And since the average time on a call is about 30 minutes, once again, we would expect that out of an 8-hour day for an officer to be on calls about 1 hour on community generated calls. And then you can anticipate some additional time for paperwork and the like. Although it is the case that increasingly now police officers, both here and in other places, aren't writing as many reports. It's much more typical now. They go on a call and they either type in notes on the CAD system or they tell the dispatcher what the resolution was. So that's some sense of the magnitude of the work. Here's the distribution of calls by month. Not surprisingly, there are more calls in the summer, but not by much. Once again, this is over the course of a year, so it's not considerable differences. And then here is the distribution by day of the week. Slightly more calls on Friday. One of the things that you'll see, which is unusual in Shorewood, is that there are more calls on the weekdays than on the weekends. Typically in most police organizations, Saturday is a busy day. There's a reason for that. The reason is, is because one of the main call categories is when the officers go and pick up the village bank deposit. That takes place only on the weekdays. And that's a considerable portion of their workload, as we'll see later in the talk. Here's the calls for service by hour. Once again, you see that spike at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when they go pick up that village bank deposit. And they do that Monday through Friday throughout the course of the year. So that's the busiest hour of the year, is 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The other thing I want to point out is if you look at 3 and 4 in the morning, that means between, let's say, for example, at 3 o'clock in the morning, between 3 and 4 in the morning, over the course of the year, they had 37 calls. That means in the late hours, there are many nights when they don't get any. So things get very quiet here after midnight. Very, very few calls after midnight. Here's the way the police are deployed. Sorry. So there's 3 shifts. There's a day shift and a midnight shift that has 1 supervisor and 2 officers on duty. The afternoon shift has 1 supervisor and 3 officers on duty. One of the things that I raised as a small problem, I would say, on occasion, the police department uses a sergeant to actually fill in as a police officer. In other words, they may be 1 below the minimum staffing, and rather than hire a police officer back to fill that slot, they use a sergeant. In my view, that's not a good practice, because I think in some sense it demeans the role of the sergeant. Sergeants should be seen as supervisors, and supervisors all the time, not just, and if even a couple times a month they're serving a role of a police officer, that tends to undermine that status. One of the things that's unusual in Shorewood is that you have 2 detectives, and that's actually a promotion. In most of the communities I've worked with all over the country, the trend now is that the detectives not be a promotion. You can call them detectives. They don't have to have that additional rank. Now, there's a couple good reasons for that. One, of course, is that if they don't have a special rank, it's much easier to move them back into patrol. It's much easier. For example, what a lot of organizations now are routinely rotating people back from detectives into patrol. An officer may spend some time in the detectives, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years, acquire those skills, and you put them back out on the street. That adds to your street capacity. Plus, it gives someone else an opportunity to go learn that detective job. The other problem is I think when you make the detectives special in terms of giving them a special rank, it tends to exacerbate this conflict between police patrol officers and detectives. In many organizations, there's a lot of friction between them, and partly because they're paid more and they have a different status. One of the things we'll talk about over the course of the night is based on our deployment data, it looks like there's a great deal of more opportunity for citizen engagement in terms of foot patrol, bike patrol, more work with neighborhood associations, and more ride-alongs. And the department has started doing some of this. Some of it they've started doing since we began our study, and that's good. We've heard from a number of people who said that they were engaged, they did ride-alongs with the police, and they thought they were very, very positive. They learned a lot about what the officer's job was like. They got to know the officer. So that's a good thing, and we ought to encourage that to the extent possible. Sorry. This shows the relationship between the distribution of calls and the distribution of officers. So you can see the majority of calls are coming during the day shift, but the majority of officers are working in the afternoon shift. Once again, that's a bit misleading because included in that number of calls during the day are the bank deposits, right? So it skews that just a bit. If you took those calls out, the deployment would be much more consistent with the workload. The city uses a prioritization scheme. Calls are classified by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with priority 1 being the most severe, most kind of life-threatening calls for service. Here's some examples. Over the course of the year, there were 24, 2 fights, 7 robberies, and 15 shots fired calls. Okay, so those are the ones in which you really want to get there quickly. This, I think, is maybe one of the most important slides for the evening discussion. I think it's very instructive to look and see what officers are doing and the nature of the calls they're responding to, for a couple of reasons. One is it's always good to kind of step back and say, are these things that we want our officers to be doing, right? Maybe it's just not a legitimate activity. Maybe there's other ways to do it, depending more on technology. Maybe there are other people who could do it, non-sworn people and the like. So let's look at some of these. The first category, as you see, is something called requests for police. This is always a problem. A lot of agencies have this kind of catch-all. It doesn't really define what it is you've asked them to do, right? And one of the things I recommend everywhere I work is you should work with your dispatch center to kind of nail this down a little bit. I asked the police department, what are these requests? And they said, well, there's some animal complaints and there's noise complaints, but it turns out those are also things that are on someplace else. So my guess is this is way too generic to be a very instructive. The parking complaints, most of these are going to the community service officers. One of the things we found, for example, when we had this discussion about what was community generated, was that about 70 parking complaints were actually created by the community service officers, right? One of the things we found out was that officers can actually create a call in the CAD system on their own. This is a very, very risky proposition. Not a good idea. And if I were you, that would be one of the things on the top of my list to stop. Imagine, if you will, some officer who was not very scrupulous could create a call and then someone else could create a false crime report, right? I mean, you could be covered on both ends. So the dispatchers ought to create the calls and nobody else. We looked at another thing, the 9/11 hang-up errors. A lot of agencies deal with this. It's a big problem. Sometimes it's just because people have a call in their pocket. A lot of people program in 911 on their phone and then intermittently dial it. But there are some good things you can do to try to avoid these. In most cases, it does not require that an officer go. The bank deposits, once again, we're recommending that you stop doing this. This is not police work in my estimation. I don't know how much cash you're getting at the village hall. My guess is that these days it's not a lot, but there may be other ways to do this. It may not need to go every day, but this to me is just not an appropriate use of police resources. Property damage only accidents. A lot of places now are getting out of the business of doing property damage crashes. Lots of ways to handle it. For one, people can come into the station and fill out the forms. In some states, you can go online and fill out the form. It's actually in many ways more convenient for the people rather than have them stand around in traffic. That's dangerous for them, and in bad weather, it can also be problematic. Burglar alarms are another area. You know, most of us realize that probably 99.9% of burglar alarms are false. They take a lot of police resources. Very often you have to send 2 officers on a call. Interestingly enough, you know, the city of Milwaukee has really been a pioneer in dealing with burglar alarms. You know, their verified response program, which has been around for a number of years, really led the way in changing the way we think about this. In Milwaukee, before the police go, the alarm company has to verify that there's actually an alarm. I think, and now that program has caught on, it's all over the country. When you think about it for a minute, it's an interesting business plan. Someone goes to a resident or a business and says, we're going to put this burglar alarm in here. You pay us money every month, and if it goes off, the police will come. Well, nobody ever asked the police about that arrangement, right? They just did it. So the police ought to have a say about that. And once again, animal complaints. Maybe there's some other way to do that other than with police officers. Once again, and some of them are strays, some of them are barking dogs. There may be other alternatives than sending an officer. Theft complaints, a lot of those now can be done online. Lots of places, if you get a minor larceny, you just go online. People just want to, sometimes they just want to report for their insurance, and it's easier for them to do it that way. Once again, found property. This largely consists of somebody going out and picking up something that somebody found. You don't need a police officer to do that. And then the auto lockout. Once again, I think this is something that's been left over from days going by where officers help people get into their cars. I don't think it's a good idea for a couple of reasons. One is there's a fair amount of liability here. You know, these locking systems are fairly sophisticated now, and if you break one, you could cost the person a lot of money. The other thing is, I'm not sure, there's a question of kind of equity here. I'm not sure most people know that if they lock themselves out of their car, that the right number to call is 911. I think most people would know, let's call a locksmith, right? I mean, that's what they would do. So unless the city is absolutely committed to doing this every single time, irrespective of the situation, I would stop doing it. So I think that's the main thing. Sorry about that. Here's the time performance. Now, I'm sorry. Remember, I talked to you before about this problem about including the calls in which the received, dispatch, and arrive time are the same. Now, if you think about it for a minute, that would mean that call, that the travel time, the time from when it was dispatched to when they arrived, would be 0, right? Because they were all the same time. So if we took those 1,000 zeros and entered them into our response time, it would grossly skew the data. It would make the response times look way too good. So we keep those out. And here's actually the response times. Now, the way you think about response time, a few years ago, a person who does fire consulting used this phrase, and I thought it's actually quite appropriate. He said, response time, you should think about the hello to hello time. That is, someone calls 911 and someone answers the phone and says, hello, 911. And the next hello is when that police car or that fire truck drives up in front of the person's house and says hello. That's what you really want to know about. So there's 4 parts to that. Someone answers the phone. There's a period of time when that information is being entered into the computer. I call that the process time. We don't have that data here. What we have is the time from when the call was reported until someone was dispatched. In other words, when it was entered into the system until someone was dispatched. Then we have the travel time. We have from when they arrived to when they cleared, and then the dispatch to finish time, which is what I call the total time. So you'll notice for all calls, from the time someone calls 911 till we get a car dispatched, it's about 4 minutes, which is pretty terrific, right? I mean, that's great for all calls. That includes a lot of fairly trivial calls, right? But for the priority calls, it's even better. We're sending somebody in less than 2 minutes, somebody's on the way, and it takes them 2 minutes roughly to get there. So that means from the time that 911 operator picks up the phone, you've got about 4 minutes until there's a police officer there. So that's terrific. That's really good performance, and you should be happy about that. By the way, this is a good measure to keep your eye on. If this starts getting longer, it's an indication of some potential problems. As you know, we had groups with a mix of residents, business people, people from the schools, people from community groups. I thought they were very, very instructive, very, very insightful. Some basic highlights. I think one of the main thought was that people wanted to know more about the police department and about police officers. Almost everyone said they thought it would be better if they actually knew the officers by name, knew something about them, got to speak with them more frequently. They wanted to know more about what the department was doing, what they were engaged in. And this is a fairly common problem. Police departments are fairly closed. They keep information sometimes secret that they don't need to. And people want to know. And we got that clear message. They want to know more about what the police are doing and they want to know more about the individual police officers. There was a generally held notion, I would say, that among the group participants, that minorities were more likely to be stopped, questioned, and treated more harshly by the Shorewood Police Department. And that was fairly widely held view, I would say. And then finally, I think the other main point was we talked a lot about the filing of police complaints. And many people said they were reluctant to file a complaint because of fear of retaliation. Some said they didn't know how to file a complaint. A lot of people said that they had shared complaints with other people, elected officials, other city officials, and they weren't sure whether the information ever got to the police department. So we'll talk about that a little bit further, but those are the principal points from the focus groups. I want to change gears a little bit and talk about traffic law enforcement. This was an area that a lot of people talked about in the focus groups and really throughout our study. I think for an effective traffic law enforcement, you're going to find 4 areas of strategy. One is people complain about traffic all the time, and police have a big job to respond to that. It's an interesting problem because people, most people, for example, in a community like Shorewood, you have a lot of people who are pretty resourceful. If they feel unsafe in their home, they might get a burglar alarm, they might get a dog, they might get better lighting, get better locks. If it got bad enough, I suppose they might move. But if someone is speeding down your street every afternoon after school, who else can you call except the police? You don't have a whole lot of options. So it's real important for the police to respond to those things. And I think Shorewood spends a lot of time and effort doing it. What I find is a lot of places do it, but they don't do a real good job communicating about it and letting people know that they're there. Accident prevention has always been a key objective of traffic law enforcement. Nobody seemed to talk about that in Shorewood in terms of preventing accidents. I didn't hear that once mentioned as a motivation for the traffic law enforcement. Many communities rely on traffic law enforcement as a visual deterrence. There's a fairly good literature over a long period of time that suggests is that visible traffic law enforcement can serve as a deterrent to crime, particularly crimes like commercial robbery and street level violence. So if that's, and there are communities that do this, I mean, that really use traffic enforcement in this way. And then finally, there's what I call pretextual traffic law enforcement. Many officers on patrol will see someone or something that looks, quote, suspicious to them, and they're driving a car or they're in a car. And they see the person commit a minor traffic law violation. Maybe they make a left turn without a signal. They use that as a pretext to stop the car, inquire who's in the car, maybe do checks on the participants and the like. This, by the way, is legal. It's gone to the Supreme Court, and as long as the officer can articulate what the probable cause was for the stop, it's generally defensible. The other kind of stop, which is taking place in Shorewood and other places, is what I call a computer-driven traffic stop. That is, an officer's on patrol, they're stopped at a red light, there's someone in front of them, and they just routinely run the license plate, right? Officers in Shorewood seem to suggest that they were taught to do this. This was part of their orientation. Here's the problem with that. Think about it for a minute. You have a person who owns a car and they failed to pay a traffic ticket, so they get a warrant, right? Well, maybe one afternoon their son or daughter borrows the car. Let's say their son. He's driving the car. The officer queries the license plate, and the computer says, the owner of that car, there's a warrant for them, right? Now, the officer now thinks this person, he's stopping a car with someone who's wanted by the police, right? That adds a little bit of adrenaline. Maybe his hand is on his gun, you know. He walks up to the car and he realizes it's not the person, but it's his son, right? So they let the person go, right? Meanwhile, what does that young person think? They think they were stopped because of their race. And I think that's a potential problem. I understand that people do this, but it seems to me that the results of this are probably not real positive. Remember, there has been no traffic violation committed at this point. So the person who's being stopped, I mean, I'm sure when the first thing they think is, what did I do wrong? Well, the answer was nothing. So it's not the best way to start a traffic encounter, in my view. Here's some of the demographics from the traffic stops. This was data that I think people always wanted. We were able to get it, and here's what it looks like. So what you can see is this is the traffic stop data for 2019. 57% of the stops were male, and as we see on the right side, 44% were minorities altogether. All right, we'll talk more about this as we go. You can see the most commonly stopped group were ages 21 to 30. That's not surprising. But one of the questions you want to ask yourself is, well, are people being treated differently because of their race? So we did what we call a contingency analysis. What this basically does is it looks at the percentages in each race and the percentages in each outcome. And then it compares with what they thought it would be if there was no effective race. So for example, on the left side, what you see is the actual numbers of outcomes. So for example, for African Americans, of the 820 people that were stopped, 363 were cited and 457 were warned, okay? Now, on the right side, we show what we think it would have been had there been no effective race. So for example, if you look at the Asians, I've highlighted that. The Asians had 59 of the Asian drivers were cited. And according to the analysis, it should have been 59.57. So in other words, for those people, we would say there's no effect. But look at the data for Blacks. For Blacks, 363 out of 820 were cited, but what should have been cited was 315 if there was no effective race, all right? And we did a statistical test. It turns out this difference is statistically significant. Now that doesn't mean that race caused this outcome. What it means is we wouldn't expect a difference this large just by chance, right? In other words, race and the outcome are dependent upon one another. And as you can also see for the white drivers, just the opposite effect, 522 were cited. What we expected to have happened would have been 569. So Blacks were overrepresented in the citation group, and whites were underrepresented in the citation group. So it does lead to have some empirical evidence of what people said in the focus groups, is that people are being treated differently.
Can I ask a question about that data? Is that all traffic stops, or is it just ones where a citation and a warning because sometimes there's a traffic stop and there's no citation or no warning. So is it the whole
My
universe? Or
these are all the stops that came from the CAD system. So it's every stop in which some officer entered some data. Yeah.
Okay. So there's other stops too that
if they don't enter that, well, if they don't enter it into the CAD system, then it's not included. But my understanding is that every call gets into the CAD system.
So every time someone stopped, even if they just give a verbal warning and say slow down or whatever, they would still enter that into the CAD system.
That's correct. And in fact, these written warnings sometimes are not actually written warnings. Sometimes they're verbal warnings. That's not one of the fields that you can choose, right? But if you read the actual record, you'll see that what they really got was a verbal warning. Right? It's one of the difficulties in the data we have. The fields aren't well constructed to answer these kinds of questions. One of the things I've put as an appendix to the report, you'll notice it's a much better way to kind of collect this traffic stop data. Any other questions on that? Here's the arrest data. The department made 415 arrests, 44% of whom were from minorities, and 69% male, right? Once again.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
When you quote all of this, 4% are minorities, we only have a very low minority rate in our community.
Yeah.
So how is that factored in?
Yes, can you just hold that question until the end?
Thank you.
It's a perfect question. I just want to. Yeah. So here's the arrest data. One of the things that we got from the arrest data, which is interesting, is where the person lived. We didn't get that for the traffic stops. We got it for the arrests. So it turns out 60% of the folks that were arrested live in Milwaukee, right? And 23% live in Shorewood. So roughly 83% of the arrests come from those two places, okay? So then we want to think, well, is there some relationship to that and race? Sorry. Okay, so here are the 250 people from Milwaukee that were arrested. 184 of them were Black. Just 1 second. And then from the Shorewood residents, 10 of the 94 were Black. Okay, all right, so what does that mean? So one of the things we try to do is compare that proportion to the population of those communities. So for example, 26% of the arrests from Milwaukee residents were I'm sorry, excuse me a second. Make sure I get this right. Yes, 26% of the Milwaukee arrests were Black. Oh, I'm sorry. 26% of the population of Milwaukee is Black. 39% of the arrests in Shorewood were Black. So the ratio is 1.9. In other words, a Black person from Milwaukee was about twice as likely to be arrested in Shorewood as one would expect. And similarly for people who live from Shorewood. They represented about 11% of the arrests, but they're 3% of the population, so about 3.6 is the ratio. Just shifting gears a bit, we asked for some data from criminal investigations. This was, I would say, surprising. The department had 577 crimes reported in 2019. Of that number, 79 were assigned to detectives, right? Or about 14%. That's pretty striking. That means that 86% of the cases got no assigned follow-up. The average time before a case was closed or suspended was 28 days, and the cases cleared by arrest were 39. Now, when you think about that for a minute, only 79 cases were assigned for follow-up. That's far less even than the number of Part 1 crimes that we talked about earlier in the day. So there's something that's amiss. There just should be a greater proportion of offenses that are being followed up. Now, generally that's a function of officer availability, but I think what we found was that there's really not a very effective screening system. There's really no strategy that says what's going to be assigned and what's not going to be assigned. And I think that's really the problem. The department has acknowledged to me more recently that this is one of the things they need to address to beef up this case assignment. But there's a lot of folks, I suspect, who are victims of crime who wonder, what's happening with that. So we'll talk about complaints. The issue that we heard the most about complaints, which was interesting, is in my earliest conversations with members of the board and with members on the focus groups, almost everybody talked about having complaints about the police. Some described having called the police, having talked with the police chief, having talked with the village manager. But then when we went to the police department, what we found was almost no complaints. There were 3 complaints for 2018 and 3 for 2019. And I think half of those were kind of internally generated. So it kind of left us wondering what was happening. So we looked pretty hard at complaints and about complaint procedures. First of all, the policy on complaint receipt is pretty good, but the language could be more inviting. And we've pointed out some of those languages there. It may seem odd, but the truth of it is that the best practice around the industry is the police departments want to encourage complaints as much as they can, right? They want to go out of the way to get complaints. A couple of reasons for that. One, it's the best way of kind of knowing if there are problem areas. It's the same way when you go visit a hotel and they send you an email a couple of days later, was anything wrong, right? Tell us, right? The other reason why you want to know complaints is you want to know about whether there are officers that are starting to exhibit some problematic behavior. And as we'll point out later today, that's a pretty critical piece of an effective management program. We found out also that we were told that all complaints go into the complaint log. It turned out that wasn't exactly accurate. There are what in this industry are called informal complaints. Someone comes into the station, perhaps they had an encounter with an officer. They weren't really happy about the way it resolved. They come in, they talk to the supervisor listens to their story, and the supervisor may say to them, if you want to file a formal complaint, that's okay, we'll take the complaint. The problem is if they don't file the formal complaint, that information may or may not get into the complaint file. Sometimes it's entered into their early intervention system, but it's not going to show up in the formal complaint file. And that's a problem. We should know about that complaint, and it should be a record that it was taken. We've talked about one of the issues on the form that the police department uses. There's a state law that says that if you file a false complaint, there's some potential sanction for that. But my read of the state law doesn't say that you have to sign to acknowledge that. But I think asking people to sign that form can scare some people away. It looks like you're threatening them with legal action. The department says it takes anonymous complaints and online complaints. There's almost no way, really no way to see about how to get an anonymous complaint. It's very, very unclear. If they're going to do it, if they're going to take online complaints and anonymous complaints, got to make that very, very clear. Finally, one of the recommendations that we included was that the police commission should start taking complaints. That's a nice alternative venue. Many of the other cities in Wisconsin are doing that. If a person is really uncomfortable with filing a complaint with the police department, they can go to the police commission and initiate that effort. Use of force investigations. most agencies collect a lot of good data on use of force. Shorewood has good policy. They're collecting data, for example, every time an officer points a gun at someone. That's really good. That's sometimes difficult to do. Officers will push back against that in some agencies because they feel it may discourage people from using their weapon. So it's a good policy. What happens is the officer fills out a description of the use of force, and then the department reviews it and kind of signs off on it. Our suggestion is that whatever investigation took place by the department ought to be memorialized. They ought to just say, here's what we did, here's who we talked with, here's our, here's the evidence that we looked at in this particular case. And then here's some different kinds of outcomes, and instead of just whether it was just good or not, there's different ways to talk about it. We recommend that the department prepare an annual report on the use of force, talking about what kinds of force were used, who they were used against, what were the circumstances, what were the outcomes, what were the resolutions. So that would be very, very helpful. I think the community would value that. Early intervention systems, it's interesting. About 30 years ago, some really great research started emerging in police organizations. What we found was that officers who got in trouble, who did, problematic things, didn't just start there. In other words, that in many, many cases, there have been a pattern of problematic behavior, but it wasn't stuff that you'd actually always notice. It was little things. And you can look at this list and see the kind of things we're talking about. For example, you start to see an officer whose reports aren't very good, or they're having minor traffic crashes. Maybe they're late for work. Maybe their uniform doesn't look real good. And the idea behind this was that if you capture all these little things, if you will, and you set up a kind of a system that says, if you have 3 of these things a month, maybe we need to stop and take a look and just call you in and say, what's going on, right? Is there something we need to know about, right? Now, the department had software that actually helped them in this task. And a few years ago, I think largely for financial reasons, they decided not to do it. Now, what they do is they enter all this kinds of information into their own kind of database, which is fine. That's good that they're collecting this information. But what's lacking is the kind of the capacity to analyze the data, right? In other words, the advantage to these systems is they tell you, this guy just got his 3rd complaint this week, right? Now, unless you went and looked for that and tried to really study it, you might not see it. So we think the cost is well worth the investment, because this is just stuff that is, and sometimes it's fairly small. And stuff, for example, might have one sergeant notices it, but another one doesn't, right? And I think that's the difference. So we would recommend that you take that route. Now you can see why it's so critical that even in these informal complaints, the ones that have been resolved by the sergeant, that makes it into that file, because that could be the beginning of a more problematic career. Okay, let me just kind of go through the recommendations now, and we can talk about some of these just in some issue. The first one is, I think, one of the things that we've found in our analysis is that the police department has a lot of discretionary time. I mean, they have a lot of time during the course of their shift. And that is it's a relatively important finding. Many of the organizations I've worked with over the years really think that the officers are going from call to call, and they'll tell you that. But then when you show them this data, they say, well, maybe we're not quite that busy. But the good news here is that they have much more time to be involved in kind of community engagement and problem solving, the kinds of things that people are actually asking them to do. Now, the department says they're doing this stuff, and I have no reason to doubt that. But what I'm finding is in some sense, it's a kind of a one-way street. That is, the department says, well, we're going to have, coffee with a cop. We're going to have a citizens police academy. And then they're a little bit disappointed that people don't show up. The reason is because the community has to be a partner in this endeavor, right? I mean, it's kind of like if you have a business, if you have a retail business, if people don't show up, you just can't keep doing the same stuff. You got to go talk to the customers and find out what can we do better so that we can work more effectively together. We talked about some of these calls for service issue. I think this is an opportunity for some fairly short-term fixes in terms of what the officers ought to do. I think you ought to figure out what it is you want your police department to do and how you want them to use their time. You know, some people probably think, well, geez, they're not very busy. So what's the problem if they're helping people break into their cars? Well, the problem is that just suggests that they don't have anything better to do. And I think, for example, the hour that they spend picking up the village bank account, they could much better spend that visiting a grocery store or some other clothing store. In other words, there's lots of things they can be doing which are better than that. We've recommended a slight change in patrol staffing. I think probably one supervisor and 2 officers are adequate on all 3 shifts. That leaves a couple extra officers for what I call kind of a flex squad, to be kind of a neighborhood policing group to help on problem solving, help on special assignments, help to fill in some of the gaps. But I don't think the workload justifies the 3 people on the afternoon shift. Now, getting back to your questions, Madam President, what do we know about all this data? Well, if you look at the 40% traffic stops of minorities, then the question becomes is, well, what's the driving population in Shorewood? What does it look like? There's ample data to suggest that maybe it's 40% minority, right? Maybe it is, right? But I think the only way you're actually going to know is to do kind of a roadside survey. You can actually engage, even I think you could do this with UWM. It'd be a great project for a statistics or a methods class. You could actually put observers on the sidewalk and have them observe the race of the people as they drive by or stop at the intersections. It's a fairly straightforward process. They do it all the time to measure people wearing seatbelts, right? So that's, I think, if you're really concerned about that, it's a worthy investment. I am a little bit more concerned about the numerator of that equation. In other words, the numbers of traffic stops and why they're conducting these traffic stops. That to me is really the critical piece. If you have an effective traffic enforcement strategy that has goals and has limits and has objectives, that'll be better. I think what you have now is pretty random, right? And you have problems both in the numerator and the denominator. So I think more strategy, more collaboration, more thought would be good. I think the whole approach to criminal investigation needs to be really kind of started from the bottom up. What you really need is some kind of a triage system, some way to decide what cases get assigned. And that requires looking at solvability factors, what evidence is collected at the scene. In terms of staffing, I think at the current level, if, for example, if the department thinks that the number of cases that are being followed up now is correct, you could do those with 1 person. You don't need 2 people to do that. And 1 person could manage that pretty easily. I suspect a substantial fraction of those cases they're following up are simply cases in which the arrest was made by a patrol officer. They're just closing it up, taking it to the DA. If, however, you use a different model, one that includes a great many more cases, maybe the second one is justified, but right now it's not. So that and getting rid of the detective rank, I think would be a good start to that. Information systems, big problem here. I mean, I've joked a couple times, but I'm really quite serious. We spent more time trying to sort out the 3,000 traffic stops in Shorewood than the 30,000 traffic stops in Louisville that I'm working on now. I mean, it's just not a very good system. What you really need is someone who knows how to work with this data. And that can make a huge difference. I worked with the police department a few years in Illinois. It's a pretty terrible place. They don't have much going for them, but they had 2 wonderful data people who knew how to get that CAD data, make it useful and timely. And it was a huge component of their reform of that organization. And finally, one of the things we were asked to talk about was this notion about whether there needs to be another oversight group for the police department. Our view is not, and it's based largely on this premise. Right now, there's half a dozen groups who have something to say about the operation of the police department. And part of what's happening is that in our view, they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. much of what the police department does is they do it kind of out of default because they don't get enough guidance. The other thing is we found there's a lot of people who talk about this, but not as much listening is going on. So what has to happen is a kind of much more collaborative effort where the police department talks to the neighborhood a lot and listens to what they have to say. And then the community listens to the police department, what they have to say. And the elected officials have a big role to play in that, as do the appointed officials. The police commission can have a much bigger role. I think the Human Relations Commission has a great role to play. They've become kind of the conduit for a lot of this information. But together, you've got lots of pieces that could do more, but do more particularly working together. I think you have enough. And having another group will simply add another evening meeting, I think, which is probably not necessary. I think you could do it with what you have. And that's basically our presentation for tonight. I have to say, I want to thank the police department and the city administration. They made this very, very, very pleasant. And I'd be remiss in not saying that the police department has made a lot of improvement. You can see it. I think they've come a long way under the chief's leadership. A lot of the things they've implemented are what I would say are kind of 90% there. It won't take much to get them to be consistent with industry best practice, but they should be commended in some sense for some of the work that they've done. So that's my talk for tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. That was very, very informative. Appreciate your time. I will, we do have on our agenda two items. One is to have the village board ask any questions and discuss, and then the following will be public comment and questions. And then I'd like to wrap that up with, again, one more round of if the board had any questions based on the public comment. So I'll open it up now to trustees or board members who may have any questions. If we could, I don't know how, I guess, Sarah, I don't have a way to see anybody's hand.
I have questions.
Okay, great. So that's perfect. If you have a question, just speak up and then it'll show me who it is. Thank you. Trustee Warren.
Yeah, and President Rosick, I actually have several questions. You just want me to go down my list so we can go trustee by trustee?
I have several too, so go ahead down your list. Okay.
First off, thank you so much for this report. It contains a lot of actionable pieces in it, and I like that. The first thing that came to mind for me is prioritization and implementation. For me, my personal bent is to prioritize equity initiatives. But that said, I'd also, maybe this is a piece you put in kind of after we have this conversation. I'd also like some more information on, ease of implementation, how implementation has gone with kind of various of the recommendations. I think that would help us in terms of how we prioritize. And then also, if you have any kind of recommendation yourself as to how we should prioritize. Again, I think there are tons of good ideas contained in here, but there's a lot of things that I'd like to dig into and kind of figure out where we are going, where we can go forward. Am I frozen?
Yeah. Yes.
Now you are. Okay. We will wait until Trustee Warren. I'll move on to see if there's anyone else that has questions, and we'll come back to Trustee Warren next. Trustee Carpenter.
Thank you for putting this together. It was really informative, and as Trustee Warren said, has a lot of great information. My first question is around.
I'm back.
Oh, you are? Okay. Well, do you want to have him answer and then come back to me, President Rosick? Is that okay? Okay.
Yep, if that's okay with you, Trustee Carpenter, since he's right back, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Trustee Warren, and then Trustee Carpenter.
Yeah, I don't know how much you heard, but I was talking about whether you could make some recommendations as to ease of implementation, how these are to be implemented. I would prefer to obviously prioritize equity initiatives, but I would like to know kind of if you have experience with implementing these policies and kind of how it's gone. Are there any traps we should look out for? Are there any things we should prioritize?
Well, I think, some of these things are going to involve negotiation with the union. Those are be challenging, right? I mean, that's going to be a somewhat arduous process. Not suggesting they're going to fight it, but it's a negotiation. I think some of the things, for example, in this practice of stopping cars based on a computer check, you could stop that tomorrow. You could stop making the bank deposits tomorrow. So some of the things, particularly with respect to individual police practices, you could stop very quickly. I mean, those are easy, right? And then some, I can prepare that in a report, some kind of short term and mid-term and long term.
Thank you.
It's stuff you can do right away, though. I think right away, yeah.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of that within the report. My second question would be, looking at these disparities, the ratios 1.9, 3.6.
Right.
Obviously, we don't want any disparity whatsoever. But I'm looking for a little more information there. I'm curious as we begin to define Shorewood's problem here, do you have any kind of benchmarking information from other municipalities that we can compare to? I feel like we're a little bit in a vacuum, and I know that I want that down to a 0 disparity, but I also am kind of curious as to where other municipalities have started from and how they've reduced that.
Well, one thing, the traffic stop data, I think is incomplete. I think as an appendix, I've included what I think is a much more comprehensive approach to collecting traffic stop data. And if you could do that, I think you'd have a much better sense of what the real disparity looked like. For example, one of the things we like to look at in traffic stop data are whether or not there was a consent search conducted. That turns out to be the area in which there's the greatest disparities around the country. And many of the communities I've worked with, one of the things they've done in response to that data is they've stopped doing consent searches. A number of years ago, the California Highway Patrol stopped doing them because the disproportionality was so significant, right? So I think what you have to do is you have to look at that and say, well, if we have this disparity, what's causing it, right? In other words, are these legitimate exercises of police discretion? One of the problems with this data is we don't really get into the officer's mind, right? If you would ask an officer about an individual arrest, say, well, geez, I didn't arrest him because he was, Latino. I arrested him because he hit his wife, right? So the question then is, are these things happening frequently enough where you see these imbalances, if you will, that we should be worried? It's like anything else. You have to have a discussion. What's going on here? Whenever you see a disparity, what I think it suggests is a discussion. In other words, a more intensive look at the data, and that's what I would suggest.
I appreciate that answer. Kind of building on that, though, as I read this report, I see things on pretextual stops, computer-driven stops, and as one who has been stopped in the past based on a pretextual reason, it brings personal for me. And my sense as I read this is I'd like to say create policy that we don't do that. And I'm wondering, is there any evidence that doing that would lead to any kind of increase in crime? Because my sense is that it wouldn't. And if we just created that policy, we aggressively said, this is not how we do things in Shorewood, there's no evidence that would increase crime whatsoever. I'm trying to anticipate any kind of counter argument to taking that kind of.
Well, I have to, that's an extraordinarily important question, because one of the things that I ask people is, why are they stopping all these cars, right? And because one of the risks you run into in some suburban departments is that the department may say, well, we want to stop suspicious people, but suspicious people are those who don't look like people who live there, right? So it's kind of implicit, right? This is what they call this implicit bias. So the question then is, why are we stopping these cars? What I wanted to get, is there a traffic safety component, right? Is this part of their crime control strategy? Nobody, by the way, in the police department says that we're stopping these cars as part of our crime control strategy. So the answer to your question would be, well, then we could stop doing it then, right? It's not going to have an effect on crime, right? The one exception is that officers said that at night, they're trying to find people who are breaking into cars, right? So they look for that, but that's a behavioral thing rather than a pretextual thing, right?
Right.
I mean, that's what you want to do. If someone is driving slowly in an area where they've had a lot of these car break-ins, right? That's a reasonable, based on suspicion. I mean, based on data. It's always better to do this based on data than just on, well, this person looks suspicious, right? Right. I think that's the problem.
Can I clarify, Trustee Warren, were you saying that we don't make policy? I misheard you, I think.
I said we do make policy.
We do, okay.
The opposite. just a couple more questions from me. Foot patrol. I do like the idea of officers being in the community, interacting with the community, walking the streets. It seems like a little bit of a throwback. I like that idea. But one thing that I would ask is, does that create any inefficiencies? Does it have a response time impact? And maybe that's something you don't have at your fingertips, but I think that's information we'd be interested in.
Well, it depends on how you do the foot patrol. That's a good question. When foot patrol emerged as a strategy, it re-emerged actually in the early 80s. A lot of people who had, larger communities said, well, geez, we can't have these folks walking around. It would take them a whole day to walk through the beat, right? So there was a very interesting test in Houston, Texas, which is a huge city, right? What the officers did was they would park their car, they'd choose a street, and then they'd walk up and down the street. They'd actually knock on people's doors and say, I'm Officer Smith. I'm your neighborhood police officer, or are there things happening here that you want to tell me about? Any problems, any things we can do to help you? Meanwhile, the car is only, 50 feet away, right? So in other words, it's not like there's no car, right? The car's with them. Now you could do that beautifully in Shorewood, right? I mean, you could do the same thing with a bicycle, right? I mean, you're talking about a place that's relatively small. You could be on across one side of in a few minutes on a bike, right? So it's great opportunity. I mean, it's a real great opportunity. The other thing you do is even you have enough, when you have excess capacity, you could take an officer and say, okay, for the next 2 hours, you're on foot patrol and we'll cover the calls, right? There are very few calls. I think that's the good news, right? That's what I was trying to say before. You have this opportunity. You have huge amounts of time for this kind of community engagement.
And thank you. One final question from me. Just as we talk about doing things like foot patrol, the community impact, and how officers could do other things within the community, I think that it would be helpful to have some general response time benchmarking. You had that slide within the presentation itself in the deck.
Yeah.
I think it would be helpful to know, are we really good on response time? Are we in the middle? Are we slow? So as we think about the impact, we can benchmark that.
You're brilliant on response time. I mean, it's really good. I mean, last year I did a study in New Orleans where it took them 7 minutes before the call went from the call taker to the dispatch. So that's for anything happens. So there's very good times. No, it's really, you don't need to worry about response time for non-urgent calls. I think one of the things that people do is they worry about response time in the general sense, right? In other words, well, if somebody, calls and says, their neighbor has been parking, you don't need to get there quickly, right? But in many ways, police organizations tend to be organized like fire departments, right? The bell goes off and you go, right? It's much better to manage your time. What you need to be able to do is get to urgent calls quickly. And that you're able to do in extraordinary fashion.
Thank you. And I have a couple more small questions, but we can take those offline so I don't take all the other trustees' time. So I'll turn the floor back over to President Rosa.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Trustee Warren. Trustee Carpenter, and then we will go to Trustee Amenta.
Thank you. So I had, I know you're going to put together sort of in priority the actionable items. And you mentioned the bank deposits. I noticed though that in that same category, well, I guess, would you group the category of lockouts?
Yeah.
Did you group that in that same category? And that's a pretty significant percentage of the calls. If I remember in the report, it's like 25% of our calls.
I can't remember the number, but it's a huge percentage. It's a huge percentage of calls that could be done other ways. That's right. Yeah.
So, because within that same list and categories, there were 2 for thefts. There was retail theft and then theft complaint. And I was just wondering, what's the difference between retail theft and theft complaint?
I presume the retail thefts are shoplifting, and the other ones are people who have property stolen. Maybe somebody stole their bicycle or something like that.
Okay. So I guess with 25% fewer calls, were you, when you were showing that, I think it was a slide or if it was in the report, but when your recommendation for changing in staffing, is that assuming that we would, drop down to, those much lower calls?
Your staffing isn't really based on the workload, right? I mean, in other words, because they're only busy about an hour or 2 out of the 8 hours, right? So even if you took some of that away, But what you really have is a minimum staffing. It's what I call a coverage model. It's a model that says, here's what we think we need to protect the officers, to protect the community. And it's a kind of anticipation of what the demand might look like.
Okay. And then I know you also mentioned the Milwaukee alarm response process. And I know personally, I have heard from residents that they feel better about the way Shorewood responds in comparison to Milwaukee, just because that does seem to take longer and that it's not quite as actionable. So, you know, I think that that particular item may be of concern to residents, you know, looking to the city of Milwaukee as a leader in that. I don't know is going to sit well, I think, with some of our residents. So,
well, no, I think these are choices you have to make, right? In other words, I'm just pointing out what other agencies have done. You know, you may decide to keep making the bank deposit. I mean, that's. But I guess the point I'm trying to make in this is that someone ought to decide this, right? When I spoke with a lot of people and I asked them, do you know that they're making this bank deposit? Most people said no, right? So, and you know, at the end of tonight or next week, someone may say, you know what, we ought to keep doing the bank deposit. But what I'm suggesting is there ought to be some discussion about it, right? You shouldn't do it by default, right? Yeah. Definitely.
And then I just had one other question, which I think I read in the report, but I don't have that up in front of me at the moment. So I thought that you had said in the report that at 10 p.m. there were a significant number of traffic stops, which I found to be pretty interesting considering the traffic volume, I would assume would be significantly lower at that time of day.
I suspect that may be because the department gets money from the state for overtime traffic enforcement. It actually pays officer overtime. And I think last year they wrote 600 tickets under that program. So, and I'm guessing that's taking place in the evenings. They're looking for seatbelts and drunk driving and speeding. So
I see. Okay.
What it does tend to suggest is it's kind of out of sync with the accident pattern and with the volume. Yeah.
Right. And I also wonder if it's more people that at that time that don't live in Shorewood that are driving through Shorewood as well.
Very good possibility.
To me feels a little bit, a lot of potential for discrimination in that time frame.
A very good possibility. Yeah.
Okay, my last question, and then I may have a few other to take offline, but the final one is about cases being followed up on. What were your findings and why did you think that there were so few cases being followed up on?
They told me that this was the result of the screening system they were using, right? It just wasn't, and you know, the thing is, there's a lot, when you have a kind of a small organization where you don't have a system for triage, then it becomes much more random. You know, in other words, for example, if someone's screening these cases and they say, well, we probably ought to follow up this one, but they're busy, right? So we're not going to follow it up. You know what I mean? So you have to have some system, right? No police organization that I know can follow up every case, nor should they, right? But they should have a method in place for deciding how they do it, right? I'm working with a big city now that gets a lot of crime and a lot of violent crime. But one of the things they do, which is interesting, is a patrol officer goes and fills out the investigation, and then working with their sergeant, they decide whether or not the case ought to be submitted to the detectives. It's basically their decision, right? And I've talked with the detectives. I said, you know, does that mean if they don't refer to you, you don't know about it? They said, pretty much. I mean, that's pretty much. So there's a kink in that system, you know. I mean, you got to have some more universal system.
Well, okay. Yeah, I may have one or two others, but we can chat more. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trustee Carpenter. Trustee Amenta?
Yeah, I had a couple of specific questions. The police commission, is it currently in the code that they can hear and handle complaints, or are you suggesting that that's added to their mission?
I believe that it is in there. I mean, we had some discussion about that. What isn't in there is some mechanism about how to do it, right?
Right.
And my understanding that it's not done. It hasn't
right.
been.
I don't think, yeah, I think the complaint procedure is all kind of internal right now. Right. One thing I didn't see in your report was a discussion about domestic disturbances, responding to mental health issues, you know, that aspect of police work that, you know, so, you know, because I sometimes think we ask police officers to be more like social workers, but it wasn't in your report. Did you have discussion, or do you have a comment or any insight onto that?
One of the things that we did look at was in terms of training. For example, we recommended that all the officers get crisis intervention training. So far, a fraction of them have had that. In many communities, that's been helpful, right? What's happening now in the police world is this real dramatic change to taking these calls away from the police, you know, the mental health calls and some fraction of the domestic violence calls. Just last week, San Francisco announced that they're going to team up fire paramedics with social workers, and they're going to be the primary response unit on mental health calls. The police will
but what about the incidents in Shorewood? I mean, is that a large part of what the police are doing in Shorewood?
Doesn't seem to be.
Doesn't seem to be. Okay. Okay.
But I think it's something to watch. You know, I mean, I think because every agency now is struggling with this issue about dealing with mental health, problems.
Yeah, I'm surprised, but since you do suggest that we could reduce some positions, what about vehicles? Can you give us, I'm not asking for right now, but maybe a follow-up of to whether we have to, is our fleet the right size, or could our fleet also be reduced?
My sense about the fleet was, it's a fairly complex calculation, because what you have to look at is kind of like, if everybody showed up for work on a shift, how many cars would that be? Right. And then you almost have kind of a relief factor for the cars. The question is when a car goes down, how long does it take to get it back? If you see what I mean? Yeah. Suppose on a given shift, you need 7 cars. And that day you've only got 6. That's a problem. Maybe the 7th car went to the shop last week and they're behind and it's not coming back.
Well, maybe that person's on foot patrol.
That may be. Sometimes it happens. It's funny. A few years ago, I did this study in the New Orleans Police Department, and every place I visited, I went to a district. They say, I see an officer. He's like an administrator. I said, what's his job? He's the fleet officer. I said, you mean he takes the cars to be fixed? They said, no, he fixes the cars. And they have police officers in the back of the stations changing bulbs and fixing transmissions and stuff. And I was so surprised by this. And they said, look, in our city garage, we take a car down there, it takes 3 weeks to get a light bulb changed, right? So it's much easier for us to just do it ourselves. He said, one police commander told me, he said, my job is to put police cars on the street. And if this is the way I have to do it, I have to do it. So I guess what I'm saying is you have to look at your capacity to keep the cars in service, right? Okay,
so another question I had when you were talking about training, you mentioned that 2018 was the last time that the department had bias training. Right. And my impression was that they had some type of training about bias every year. Is that not true?
That's not true.
Okay. Okay.
Well, they should. That would be good. It should be an ongoing thing. Yeah.
Is it safe to say that other than the 2 calls per shift or whatever might be coming in, that all that discretionary time, like a large portion of it is traffic enforcement? That's kind of what I'm getting sort of between the lines.
It's a big part of it. They do a lot of what they call kind of a lot of business checks. They drive around, make sure doors are locked, and okay. They visit a lot of business. I think the guys on the midnight shift particularly, they go in the bars and they so I think there's a lot of that kind of proactive checking of business. I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
I did just want to, and I talked to you earlier today, I did just want to mention in terms of the role of the board. I've been on the board now almost 6 years, 5.5 years. And while we do talk about the police department during budget, and we were involved in some discussions about filling positions and CSOs versus officers and sort of reorganizational type stuff. But I can't think of a single time that any like operational policy type issue has been ever brought to the board, the village board, for discussion. For example, I mean, I think, and you bring up, and you, excellent report, by the way. I really, there was a tremendous amount of really interesting things to read in here. So I did want to mention that too. But I mean, sort of systemic crime problems. And I think, I know I have communicated with the police chief about some issues that I think would be great if the police department were focusing on, particularly around drug dealing. And I also think retail theft. But it seemed, but I just want to let you know, and the public know, I can't recall ever being asked as a village board to have any kind of input. And also, you know, people need to understand that we as a village board we can suggest things that we would like to discuss and bring up once a year, bring up priorities that we would like to discuss, but we actually don't have the ability to, we don't create our own agenda, and we don't really have input into our agenda. So I think a little bit, there's a little bit like, I think your perception of the types of things that we are involved in, or even have the ability to discuss and make a policy decision about, in truth, we don't have that ability. Right. So I just wanted to.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that that's part of the problem.
Part of what?
Part of the problem.
I agree. I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Menta. Trustee Ursing, then Trustee Stokebrand.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. This has been just a really fascinating discussion, and really appreciate all your time and energy put into this topic. It's really important, and it's, I think, the forefront of all of our minds. You know, I guess my question is a little bit more straightforward, and maybe a little bit more general. I know that a lot of what you do is data driven, but there has been, you know, a perception in our community that our, you know, police department, our police officers are racist. And, you know, by you doing what you do through all the different communities you've been through throughout the years, and running the numbers and looking at you know, the data, would you say that comparing our police department to others' police department, would you say that our police are acting in a racist manner or fashion?
Well, two important points. One is, even in the most sophisticated data systems, and I've been studying this data for 20 years now, we don't know what's going through an officer's head, right? We don't know that, right? All we see is these numbers which reflect the outcome, right? And the outcomes themselves don't lend themselves well to kind of a pass-fail score, right? When the racial profiling studies first began, some colleagues of mine in the Northeast did a study in Rhode Island, and they constructed ratios much like what we saw today. And they said, if there was a ratio of greater than 2, that indicated evidence of racial bias, right? Well, one of the local newspapers, when they saw the results, the headline in the Boston newspaper was, you know, half of the police departments in Rhode Island failed the test, right? And we were real careful in Illinois not to do that, right? So what we produce is we produce the ratios, right? Once again, a 1 means that there's no evidence of bias. 2, it means it's twice as likely as 1, right? So there is a kind of a, you know, a continuum there. And I've had people over the years, you know, city managers, mayors call me up and say, is this a bad number? And I'm always very cautious to say whether it's a good number or a bad number, you know? It is the number, right? In other words, this is what you're dealing with. It can change, it can get better, it can get worse. But what it does is it gives you a place to begin the discussion. In other words, why is this happening, right? And I don't think you can say our officers are racist. I think what you can say, I mean, I think one of the things we pointed out is some of the tactics that they're using could lead some people to believe that they were the subject because of race, right? That's different, right, than saying someone is a racist, right? So that's my point. I mean, I think that's what you have to think about is, are there things that we're doing that can be interpreted either by the subject of the person who gets it, right? Or by others. I was talking the other day with a colleague of mine who used to be the chief of police in San Jose. They had a problem there. Whenever they'd stop a car with several young people and they'd have them sit on the curb, right? They'd get them out of the car, they'd have them sit on the curb. And I guess it was to keep them from running away or something. But anyway, he said, we thought it was an okay strategy, but then we actually did an analysis and it turned out we were much more likely to do it with Latino youth than we were with anybody else, right? So there was this racial element to it, right? Now, I don't think officers said, okay, I got this carload of Latinos, I'm gonna put them on the curb. The question is they were just doing it, right? And they were doing it more frequently. And I think that's the difference. So I think what you do is you have to say, we have this difference, right? I mean, it's the same thing we showed about different outcomes in the traffic stops, right? You have to think, well, is there a reason for this, right? If there's no reason, then it must be something else, right? Race must be part of it, right? And that's where you begin that discussion.
Thank you. Trustee Ursink, do you have more? No, you're okay. Trustee Stokebrand.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh.
I have audio problems. Can you hear me?
You're good now. Yeah, I can.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Alexander, for all of your work. I think this is a very important starting point for us.
Thank you for your help.
And you've given us so much to work on. I hope that we can make some changes quickly. Other things will take months or years, but this database, all this information, and thank you so much to the staff who participated, all the people in those focus groups, it's all information we need. And I just have a few quick questions about the data.
Yeah.
So a village of our size to put someone, my question is it smarter to get a better data system that everybody can get information out of, or do we need to hire a data analyst because the system is so cumbersome?
That's a good question. There's two parts. One is you're collecting the wrong data, particularly on the traffic stops. You're not getting enough data, right? I mean, that's why I included that appendix. You need to collect a lot more data about traffic stops. For example, what was the reason for the stop? You're not getting that now, right? You're getting kind of what the outcome of the stop was. So you need to collect different data. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with respect to this. All I know is we had a heck of a time getting this stuff, right? Some of it was in there. My experience with these data systems is some of them are real good about putting the data in, but not so good about getting the data out, right? There are vendors, some of which are less scrupulous than others, who set it up so that if you want to get something out, you got to go back to them and pay them more money, right? So, but what I'm suggesting is if you find someone who's used to working with, particularly with CAD data and other police information systems, they'll learn how to use that records management system to be able to make these kinds of queries and get regular reports, right? There's already some data online. The police department example is posting calls for service data. Citizen can go online right now and see where traffic stops are, where the calls for service are. That's all already available. So if you wanted to make a completely transparent system, I think you'll need some help with that. But basically you need somebody within the city, village government who understands how to get that data. My experience has been is when you ask questions, when you ask for data the first time, it's a struggle, right? You know, people, well, we think we have that. A few years ago, I did a study in Peoria, Illinois. It was funny, I asked for some data and everybody said, we don't have that. And I went to see some data person said, oh yeah, we had that. The chief 20 years ago used to get that. So it was there, just no one was asking for it anymore. So, but you have a community that wants to know, right? So this is a fairly high priority to get this stuff out there so they can really take a good look, you know.
Thank you.
You're on mute.
I see that. Thank you. I see that. if that's all for you, Trustee Stokebrand, I'd like to take the time to ask my questions, and then we will open it up for public comment and then circle back to the board. Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to share that when I first got elected 5 years ago, just as a board member, and stayed on the board for 2 years, I was the public safety chair. And what I realized quickly in the village, what I personally realized, was that we had a data and documentation problem everywhere in the village, not just the police department. So I wanted to share that because that was the goal of my term, was to become more transparent as a village government. Get documents online, be able to have residents oversee our departments by being able to access data, getting elected officials the ability to see documents so they didn't have to call and request them from the administration. Those types of things that I think are inherently better today, 6 years later, but definitely not where we need to get to yet. So focusing on the police department, I'll just share with you that whether the police are racist or not racist, I think that transparency goes a long, long way. And in our community, I think we're all very aware that people want to be involved here in Shorewood. They want to know, and they want conversation. And I've requested that a lot with the police department in my first term. And I'm just sharing this because there was a lot of roadblocks put up to have those community conversations. And so I do think it's worthwhile thinking about like a town hall setting to talk about race relations with police officers, or data availability, whatever the topic may be. I've always pressed for those in my first 2 years, and those were not received well. So I received pushback from our own departments. So I think that those will go a long way if we keep that in mind. Just access to data puts people at ease, a lot more at ease. So I think your recommendation for being able to access that data better for residents or for elected officials when we need it, I think that would be, that's probably my #1 recommendation, is to increase transparency into the department. What I don't understand in the report, and maybe you can expand on it, is the change in staffing and of the detectives. I think there was something in the report talking about investigations that, I think, how do we determine which investigations move forward? I've heard that from residents and from elected officials on our board currently, that, they'll put in something and nothing happens. And where does it go from there? So could you just, the other thing the report had mentioned was that sometimes the investigation turns on the victim. Can you just expand on that?
Are you talking about complaints or about crime investigations? I'm sorry.
I can't remember, but it was something to do with the detectives' investigations.
Well, let's talk about the complaints at first. Okay. I think one of the big issues with the complaints is that there's no system by which the complaints make it to the police department, right? I think my recollection is most of the elected officials, for example, told me that they had received complaints about the police and communicated those complaints to the police, right? To the police chief, right? But they don't appear to be anywhere, right? There's no record of them. So there has to, and I think, I think one of the things that has to happen is if someone calls a trustee and to complain about the police, they have to tell them, the way to do this is to file a complaint with the police department. Here's the form, here's the online link. In other words, you have to explain to them that that's the procedure. Or if they don't want to do that, then I think you as a village trustee have an obligation to make sure that somebody knows about this, right? Otherwise people just walk around thinking that someone's going to do something about it, right? You know what I mean? So that's part of it. Now, on the investigation side, on the detective side, what's happening is a very small fraction of the cases are being assigned for follow-up, right? Presumably there's some logic or algorithm that's in place to decide what cases get followed up and which don't, right? And whatever it is that is, it's producing a relatively small fraction of cases that are being followed up. So what my point is if that's the algorithm you continue to follow, you don't need two people, you just need one, right? But if you adopt a more logical, a more rational approach to deciding which cases get followed up, you may need two. Or you may stay with one and then have the patrol officers do more follow-up, right? They have the time to do that. I worked a few years ago with a police department in Ohio, in Delaware, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus. There, that's a bigger city than yours. There, I'd say 95% of the follow-ups are done by patrol officers. The detective, I think one detective for a city of 30,000 people who handles only the most serious cases. That's an option as well. And by the way, the officers would like that. It gives them more direct contact with the community. So that's an option as well.
Thank you. I only have one last concern or comment, and that is the police commission. I do agree with you in my perspective, from what I've seen, that people are scared of retaliation in the community, especially people of color, of what they do if there is a complaint. I don't know why. I'm not assuming anything. I've observed that. The police commission, I believe, can play a more active role. I believe the village board, I also agree with you that the village board needs to play an oversight and active policy making role. We have been shut down from that, in my opinion, told we don't really have a role in the police organization. We're not in charge of the police chief. And we also, really, police operations are left up to the department. And so I'm happy that you have brought that to our attention as a board, that we should play a more oversight and policy-making role. That's the first time I've heard that in 5 years. So thank you.
My question is, if not you, then who, right?
I do believe too, we have a lot of organizations trying to do oversight,
right,
but not being received well, and that to change and say one of them, like the police commission, might have that role or help guide some things about the complaint process is not an easy thing at the moment. And so, although we have these different oversight mechanisms that are in place, they're not utilized. And so I don't know what the next step is going to be. I know we're going to talk about that as a board, but how do you achieve that when there may be pushback? And that is what I think we need a little assistance on.
Yeah. The most important issue here is trust. A resident who has a complaint against the police has to believe that that complaint is going to be handled fairly and comprehensively, and that they're going to get justice, right? If you get there, it doesn't matter actually where it goes, right? In other words, that's the main point. That's the main point. And even the language in the forms that people are asked to fill out puts the onus on the victim to prove that this thing really happened, right? The police department ought to go out of their way to find out whether this thing really happened, right? That's the difference, right? And that's hard. I mean, that's a huge change, but you have to do it, you know? That's the success, yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more. So I think with that, I will turn it over to public comment. I do appreciate everything. The only thing that I would ask, I don't know how to get the next steps done. So we'll come back to that issue, and hopefully you can assist us, because if it's hiring another consultant, I'm ready, like providing more hours for consulting. If it is data collection, we just missed the budget, but we do have reserves. So I'm ready for that as well. If we need an analyst or whatever the recommendations may be in priority, we can get there, but it will take an extreme amount of work and dedication to the issue. And I think the community is asking for that. So with that, I would like to turn it over for, yes, Justice Stoker.
Can you hear me? I still have audio issues. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I guess my question about, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question is, I do think we need to get a definitive answer about our police commission and taking complaints, because it's my understanding that we would need to pass a referendum for them to take on that role, which of course we can do, but it's just something we need to check out. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you address that, Mr. Weiss? Do we need to do a referendum?
You know, I have to, I looked at the rules for the commission, and my impression was they have the capacity to do it, but I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what the legal foundation would be. The discussions we had were suggested they could do it, but there was no budget for them, for example, to hire somebody to do the investigation, you know, so that would be the challenge, right?
Well, I think we're in charge of budget, the village board, and we haven't been asked that. Did that answer your question, Trustee Stokebrand?
I can look at it again tomorrow and figure out.
Okay. If that's all right, I will look at Sarah, our clerk, and can you go ahead and take public questions and comments at this time?
Yep. We will start with Jeff Davidian. Jeff, if you can unmute yourself and state your name and address, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Weiss, thank you very much. I've got several questions. I'm going to just try to make them yes and no, just to get through them. Did you get the data, the police data yourself, that is the digital spreadsheet or whatever format it comes in, or were you given a report or tables with the information on it?
The traffic stop and arrest data, we actually got the raw data.
And with that raw data was for what period?
2019.
For the year 2019.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you get the remarks field?
No.
Okay. So anything that would be there, we're not able to discuss.
I didn't even look at that. No, we're not. No, we didn't do that. We just looked at.
You didn't. Would they have made it available had you asked for it?
I imagine they would have. Yes.
Okay. In what format did you get the data?
Well, it was an Excel spreadsheet.
It was in an Excel. Yeah. Did you put it in Excel, or was it given to you in Excel?
Well, I think it was given to me in Excel. So,
okay.
I mean, it took my data analyst a while to kind of sort it out.
Okay.
Because it was a report from. It didn't look like an Excel spreadsheet, but it had characteristics of a spreadsheet. He was able to figure it out. So
you're saying it was a report. It was not the records.
No, they were the individual records. It wasn't a summary of them. They had the individual records. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Weiss, did you by any chance have an opportunity, or did you look at reconciling the police revenue that comes from making photocopies of public records requests, and then reconciling it with what is written on the request that shows how many pages there were?
No.
Okay. Were you charged for the data?
Was I charged? No.
Yes. Were juvenile records included with the data that they gave you?
Probably, yes. I would say so, yeah.
Did you have were you exempted from the state law that requires them to keep that confidential?
Well, I didn't have any names, if that's what you want to know. I mean, I just had.
Just curious. Can we get a copy of what you got?
Not from me, but I'm sure you can get it.
Who does that belong to?
Right now, it belongs to me. So.
Okay. Well, can I buy a copy?
I don't think so.
Well, it's village data. I don't know, and I'll deal with this otherwise. I don't want to argue.
Okay.
What is the clearance rate of let's say felonies in Shorewood compared to other?
Alexa, Bluetooth.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Mr. Davidian, are you still there?
I'm here. I'm here. I'm sorry.
Okay, and I heard the question, Mr. Weiss, and I'm going to try to ask all public comments and questions to be limited to three to 4 minutes if possible. So if there's if the most important questions that you have, if you could prioritize those. But Mr. Weiss, he talked about felony data.
Yeah, it's in the report actually on one of the top. It's right in the beginning of the report. It shows you the arrest rate for Part 1 offenses.
Okay, I have one other question. You said that the village is not gathering or maintaining the data that we need in order to do an intelligent oversight or monitoring of the village. Do you have a template?
No, I didn't say that. I said they're not getting the right data for the traffic stops. Yeah.
Do you have a template or something that would show what data should be included for efficient policing and for citizen oversight? Do you have a template like that?
I have a template for the traffic stops. It's the appendix to the report. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay.
Next, we have Sharvita Parker. Sharvita, if you could unmute yourself and state your name and address, please.
Hello, good evening. I will not be stating my address, but my name is Sharvita Parker. I'm chair of the Human Relations Commission.
Can everybody hear her? Because I can barely hear her. You guys can. Sharvita, is there a way? I'm sorry, Ms. Parker. Can you turn? Is there a volume or?
No, there isn't.
Okay. Can you guys hear her? You can? Okay, go right ahead.
All right, thank you. So as chair of the Human Relations Commission, I do want to say that this is the same complexes and problems. First of all, I want to thank Alexander Weiss. I'm glad that we made a really good decision in moving forward with the police study. The data that he was able to obtain are the same roadblocks that we as the Human Relations Commission, and there is a data subcommittee member on here, and I don't know if she would like to speak to this nature, but I just believe that the troubles and the complexes that we had in obtaining data as just a commission are just really revealed by the problems that Mr. Weiss has had. I do want to say that this data, it does create transparency, and it also reveals what many of us minorities who travel and who do live and socialize here in Shorewood have always heard and observed. So I do just want to bring attention and awareness to this. And so it starts with us as a community and realizing that this is what it is. And especially if you are aware of what covenants and just training and implicit bias that brings awareness to this whole situation, so it's really a matter of the community being able to look within themselves and see that many of us minorities who reside here in the community and who do serve professional jobs that require licenses, I'm just saying, I'm making a point, that are treated like in some capacities as criminals, and just the type of treatment that's received only brings greater awareness to this problem, that we have to look within and be able to accept the results of the data. Really is what it comes down to. Accept the results of the data so that we can move forward. If people are not willing to accept the results of the data, we will continue to be in the position that we are in. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. Everyone have a good evening.
Very much appreciate Ms. Parker coming and taking the time as the HRC chair to share your thoughts. Thank you. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yep, next we have Aaron Schultz. Aaron, if you could unmute yourself and state your name and address, please.
Hi, my name's Aaron Schutz, and I am a board member of Shorewood Moving Forward and vice chair of the combined Shorewood Solidarity Network, Shorewood Moving Forward Police Accountability Committee, of which a number of other folks here are members. My residency is at 4225 North Woodburn. I guess I just want to, having read through the report, I want to kind of summarize what I think it says and see if Mr. Weiss agrees with this. So the first thing that it seems to say is that there is clear evidence of racial inequity in policing in Milwaukee, especially with Shorewood residents. The second thing it seems to show is that there is a clear demand for real collaboration with the police officer, police department, and the community that involves a collaborative two-way communication that leads to some change. The third thing that I saw in the report was that there's a clear need for a much better complaint process that should probably be overseen by the police commission, whose initial rules indicate that it in fact was supposed to be doing this all the time, but was not. The fourth issue is about the extremely problematic way that data is collected and made available to the community in order to allow real transparency about what's going on with the police force. And the last is that there's a clear demand for more oversight of the police department, although we can argue or disagree about exactly how that should take place. So are those fair summaries of the kind of core conclusions? I didn't get into the staffing issues.
Yeah. No, I think the only one I would, my only caveat is about whether or not the police commission should have had this oversight role. I'm just not in a position to answer that. But the remainder of them, I think, are fair characterizations of the report.
But you have seen the initial rules of the police commission, and in the initial rules of the police commission, it says that they are supposed to be overseeing complaints.
I have no reason to doubt you, sir. I just don't recall that. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Aaron. Next, we have Chuck Carlson. Chuck, if you could unmute yourself and state your name and address, please.
Good evening, Chuck.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I tried to start my video, but it doesn't look like it works. So I am on the police commission. I was appointed in May. The police commission has met since that time only once, and it was to meet with you. And at that commission meeting, I did receive the rules and regulations of the police commission, which I have confirmed with the president of the police commission. And there is an informal citizen complaint process that is outlined there.
There's my recollection.
I did confirm with the president that these are the rules that govern the police commission. So there is no need for a referendum to change that ability. Secondly, my question is about the computer-driven traffic stops. And if you considered how grants are done for our police force and how that does or does not affect the people who are pulled over and the reasons they are pulled over.
Well, you know, many communities get money from their state governments to do highway safety work. It's been that way for 50 years. It was a way that the federal National Highway Traffic Safety Administration chose to encourage local police departments to do more traffic work. They pay for overtime to do traffic work. One of the problems with it is the state, when they give you the money, they have certain targets. They say, well, it's for seat belts or OWI or for speeding. That may or may not be problems in your community, but in order to get the money, you have to agree to do that. So my thoughts about the grant are, one, you have to decide, do we want that kind of constraint? In other words, is that consistent with our overall traffic enforcement program? Does it make sense for us? And two, do we want that additional level of traffic enforcement? In other words, in terms of the volume, right? One of the ways I presume that the council, I mean, the trustees, for example, have to approve that money coming from the state, right? I don't know that for sure, but somebody's got to sign off on that. So that's a good example of a policy decision. Somebody has to agree to take that, to enter into that contract with the state. At least that's the way it is in Illinois. Somebody, you know, the government has to agree to enter into that contract. So.
Can I just, is Rebecca on the line or Chief Nimmer? Do you know who signs off on that? Because I haven't even presented it to that at the board. Chief? Sarah, I see you on the call.
I thought Chief Nimmer was on the line. I am not sure of the process for that.
Okay, so it's not the board and it's not the manager. Chief? Sarah,
he is on. I just don't know if he can unmute.
If you get him on, maybe we can follow up with that before we get off the call.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Mr. Carlson.
I just wanted to say thank you very much to Mr. Weiss for the excellent work. So thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. If you could, there was something that you owed the police commission policy that you have read and been distributed. If you could send that to my email and I can distribute it to the board so everyone has a copy as well. Sarah, go ahead.
Yep. Next we have Kristen Cierto. Kristen, if you could unmute yourself and state your name and address, please.
Hi, thanks, Rebecca. Yes, my name is Kristen Cierto, and I'm at 4018 North Morris Boulevard. And first I wanted to thank Mr. Weiss for this report. This was really illuminating. I will say that there was an earlier question about what this says about whether or not what's going on, whether or not someone in Shorewood is racist. And I think that it would be really wise for us all to think about what we mean when we talk about racism and not just focus on individual intention, but look at systemic practices. And so I appreciated, Mr. Weiss, how in the report you talk about implicit bias, because it's not about what any of us mean to do. It's about us recognizing the patterns that are here in the data and figuring out what are the policies and procedures that we need to adopt in order to make positive change. And so I also appreciate Trustee Warren's earlier comment about maybe if we change this, and again, Mr. Weiss's comment about changing the traffic stop driven approach and adopting a data driven approach. And so I have two questions for Mr. Weiss. The first is, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the idea of a data driven approach. And the reason I'm asking this in particular is I'm wondering what kinds of data. In addition to there being more data collected by the Shorewood Police, I'm also wondering about if you've given advice to places about what kinds of data they can be getting from other entities in the area. For example, at the School of at UW-Milwaukee, in the School of Architecture and Urban Planning, there are people who study traffic, and there have been identified hotspots of traffic accidents around the Milwaukee area. 2 of them are in Shorewood, and I'm not sure that this information has ever gotten to the police here. And I'm wondering what other kinds of data are useful data for the police to be working with. Secondly, I appreciate your recommendation about enhancing current oversight rather than making the oversight more complex using the tools that we have. And so I'm wondering if you have any, and you gave some advice about the CPPS model, but I'm wondering if you have specific examples of or suggestions as for training, because it seems like not only, has there not been an awareness of what is in the charter of the police commission, but also what kinds of training could people be going through to learn to be better police commissioners, et cetera, those who are interested in willing to serve the public and with the police, what works well. And thank you for your time.
Let's talk about the data. Thank you for your comments. On the traffic side, data is really the key, because what you want to do is focus your initiatives on high accident locations, and particularly those in which there's lots of injuries or fatalities. So that data is pretty readily available. I think you can get that data from the Department of Transportation, or as you say, from UWM. I didn't see any evidence of that in terms of a kind of a place-based traffic enforcement strategy. The one thing they do is they respond to complaints. Those tend to be driving a lot of the traffic enforcement. With respect to crime and problem solving, I guess what I mean by data-driven is getting as much information as you can about the nature of these offenses. For example, almost everyone we talk with said that motor vehicle theft is a big problem in Shorewood, but there, were 10 in 2019, right? And I suspect a few of them were people who left their cars running in the morning and let them warm up outside. Somebody took them and drove them a half a mile or something. So the key is if you have a problem, whether it's a drug problem, a motor vehicle theft problem, a loitering problem, a retail theft, is gathering as much information as you can about those problems. Some of that's going to come from crime reports. Some will come from the CAD record. Some will be simply talking to people who are involved. So it's data, which is both quantitative and qualitative. That's what I mean by having a data-driven organization, where you focus the limited resources you have in the places where you'll get the most bang for your buck. Now, with respect to training the commission, that's an interesting point. I don't know of anything offhand, for example, where you could provide that kind of training, but there are places that provide it. I know, for example, I've done some training for the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at Ohio State, and they have a whole series of courses just for local elected officials in Ohio. So there may be a similar program available for local elected officials in Wisconsin facing these same kinds of issues. So.
Thank you. Was that all your questions, I assume? Thank you for those. Sarah?
Yep. Next, we have Liz Egan. Liz, if you could unmute yourself and state your name and address, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Egan. Sarah, I emailed you my proof of residence. I have 3 questions for you tonight. This was hugely, like Kristen said, illuminating. I wonder if you can tell us if there's any level of insight into how many non-white, non-male officers we have, and what is their average tenure in the department?
I have that in the report. I have to look it up. There are a few that are not white. And
if it's in the report, I can.
It is in the report. I did include that, but I think they're fairly new. Yeah.
Okay. And then, is there a practice that you found within the department, or is it a culture of which we reward, or not even reward, but aren't punitively acting against those who bring up problematic practices or potentially biased actions by officers, by fellow officers themselves? Is there any of that is there any of that in the...
I didn't sense that there was that kind of friction. Maybe after more time I might have found it, but I didn't sense any of that. I asked on occasions, do you talk about race? Do you talk about these issues? And everyone said we talk about it all the time, but perhaps not in the context that you're describing. I think it has more to do with how are we as an organization going to deal with this kind of notion that people think we're all a bunch of racists, right? I think they deal with that every day. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Last question. Do you have a sense of how much influence the police union has on policies, or any has on the Shorewood Police Department?
I'm sure they have some. I heard anecdotally that they they do, and they have good lawyers. That's what I heard. Interestingly enough, I've looked at their contract, and it's not as restrictive, for example, as those in Illinois. You know, for example, I mean, and I think you've had unions there longer than the ones in Illinois, so it's interesting. They're less, for example, in Illinois, police contracts almost always specify elaborately description of investigation about police officers, you know, how those things are done. There isn't much language about that at all. So,
okay.
No union that I know of in Illinois would let a sergeant fill in this for a minimum staffing level for a police officer. They'd want that money for themselves. So that indicated to me that, you know, but I'm sure there are issues that over which they are you know, they're contentious. Unions have a place. I mean, unions have a, you know, they have lots of issues they want to protect their members, but I didn't get a sense either way that this one was particularly problematic. I've seen much worse ones, so.
But not to say that there aren't potentially issues there.
Sure, I mean, it's the nature of the enterprise, right? I mean, the union has its members' interest at heart. That's what it's designed to protect its members. And at times that'll be at odds with the interest of the community. I mean, it's just by definition, right? And that's not to say you can't work it out, but there are times in which there's that conflict. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, if there's any more residents who would like to speak, okay, Beth Jakubowski, if you could state your name and address, please.
Yes, Beth Jakubowski, 3827 North Prospect. I had lowered my hand because I wanted to ask about this quota system for getting grant money, and so that was answered, but it just really concerns me that it seems like an antiquated practice, and it's just forcing our police officers to go out there and try to get as many tickets as possible for these specific things so that we can get money to fix our roads, it sounded like. And I mean, I understand the need for the money, but it just seems like we'd rather have our officers protecting and serving and not feeling like they're lurking around trying to find people to pull over so that they can get qualified for these grants. And I feel like it puts them in a difficult position too. I'm wondering if any other municipalities are finding ways to get rid of this practice but still obtain the funds that are needed.
You know, I don't know the situation in Wisconsin, but in Illinois, they line up for these grants. In many communities, they fund the whole traffic safety program with these grants. So and I don't think it has anything to do with getting highway money. I mean, with road repairs or anything. It's just they pay police overtime. That's the principal objective. You know, they pay for the whole drunk driving program in Chicago, for example. So the state of Illinois.
It seems odd that you have to have a certain number of stops in order to qualify for this.
I don't think you have, I don't know that for sure. I didn't say they had to have a certain number of stops. There are expectations about what they're supposed to do. And I suspect if you got the money and for several years you didn't do anything with it, they might not give you the money again, but I don't know whether there's specific performance expectations. I didn't say that.
Well, we had heard from our chief that there is a quota that has to be filled, and it's for seatbelt infractions, OWIs, and speeding tickets in order to qualify for this money.
Yeah, I don't, those are the, I don't know what the, I mean, that may very well be the case that they have to write a certain number, but I don't know what that is. And so.
Okay, in this day and age, it seems like a very strange practice to me.
It's a very common practice.
Thank you. If there's no other questions or comments, Sarah, go ahead.
Chuck Carlson has his hand raised again. I just want to see if there's, before I call on him, any additional residents that they have their first time to talk. If not, I will let Chuck go. All right, Chuck, you can unmute yourself and.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, it came up about the race of the officers in Shorewood, and you had talked about officers walking a beat. Do any of the officers live in Shorewood? And do you know of communities that have required that? And what are the benefits or the negative sides of that?
I don't know whether they live in town. I think probably not. Someone told me, I think that in Wisconsin now you can no longer require them to live in the town. I heard that. I may not. I think that, the evidence is mixed on that. There are cities, Chicago, for example, requires police and fire to live in the city. But they all live in the same neighborhood. I mean, if you go to the northwest side of Chicago, it's all police and firemen. So it's not. I'm not sure that was the objective of it. So I think it's a limited value. I think part of the problem is that there are communities in which officers can't afford to live, right? So I'm not sure it makes much sense. But there are cities, it's more particularly big cities that require this because they think, and it goes back to the times when many of these jobs were kind of patronage jobs. In other words, if you're going to get this city job, you should live in the city. But the evidence is, I don't think the strong evidence suggests that it makes much difference in terms of performance.
All right. Next, we have Sherry Luckett. Sherry, if you could unmute yourself and state your name and address, please.
Sure. Sherry Luckett, 4419 North Sheffield Avenue. Thanks for pulling this together. I just wanted to ask, is there anything that you feel could have enhanced your analysis for this particular topic that would have probably made it even better?
Oh, that's a good, interesting question. I think if they collected different traffic stop data, I think we could have done a more comprehensive look at the traffic stop data. But I think based on what we had, we did okay. You never get 100% of what you want, but that would probably be the one thing. But other than that, I think they went to great lengths to make sure that I had what I needed. So,
do you feel like because the data that you have is based on what was collected at the site or at the scene of the crime, if you will, but do you feel like because it's a human touch, do you feel like it may have been incomplete, or maybe there may be some pieces that may have been left out, or you don't necessarily have a complete picture per se? And do you feel like we need additional years to do, or additional years of data to be able to create a clearer picture?
I'm pretty comfortable with what we had right now. I mean, in that sense, I know what I think I know what you're asking. I mean, I've worked in communities where there was huge holes in the data. For example, traffic stop data where they asked the race of the driver, and a third of the times they put down that it was unknown, right? So that makes it difficult to do a complete analysis, but I didn't encounter that here.
Do you feel like an extra few years would have kind of made, actually, maybe you didn't have access to the extra years?
No, I got what I asked for. No,
okay.
I'm comfortable with that, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Sarah, is there anybody else?
There is nobody else at this time.
Okay, I'm just going to thank you all to everybody that was in the public that spoke tonight and everybody that's listening in. I will go ahead and turn it back over to the board. Yes, Sarah?
I was like, Liz Egan did raise her hand again, if you're okay to take a second comment.
Liz, did you say Liz?
Yep.
Yep, we can take one more second comment and then we'll move it back to the board.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. I just wanted to ask that in the next process, should we move towards finding another consultant, that this was, Alex, this is wonderful. I would hope that the board would ask for public comment before finalizing the list, because sometimes we have a line of insight and oversight of things that you aren't seeing that we could be helpful in providing you. So just a request there.
Excellent request. Thank you, Liz. So I will just go down and call upon each board member to see if you have any further questions after public comment here, and then we'll move on to the next suggested draft agenda. So Trustee Amenta.
I'm really thinking about where we go from here. To me, there's three issues: data, disparities, and community connections. That I would like to see us move forward on. And I guess the question is, where is that in Public Safety Committee? Is it full board? Is it HRC? So I think we need maybe at our next meeting discuss where we're going next and what our next steps are. That's all. Thank you.
Trustee Ursink?
No further comments.
Okay. Trustee Stokebrand?
Yes, I have a question. Just a minute. I'm sorry. A lot of problems with my audio. So if we are concerned about traffic stops for OWI and seatbelts and speeding, it seems to me in a community like Shorewood, where we have a lot of focus on walking and biking, would we really want to cut back on state grants that could help us catch people? I happen to live on a very busy street, and my neighbors tell me they want more patrolling for speeding and things like that. So is there a way to keep that state money, in your view, Alex, and patrol for those things that are important in a community like ours and avoid any type of racial disparity?
Well, there are different issues. One is, on the one hand, there's nothing wrong with getting money for traffic law enforcement. What I'm suggesting is it needs to be part of a comprehensive traffic enforcement program. If it's just sitting out there by itself, right? Like this is our overtime program, right? Without connecting it to these issues of traffic safety and the like, that doesn't make much sense. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question? What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Trustee Stokebrand, did you have a second part? We may have to come back to her.
I think I missed it, sorry.
We're going to come back to you, Trustee Stokebrand, right after Trustee Warren. Trustee Warren? Did Trustee Warren freeze? Oh, audio.
I'm back.
Okay, go ahead.
I did freeze, but now I'm back. Just maybe no more questions, but thank you to everyone who spoke up. We really appreciate the public comment that we've received here tonight. Am I frozen again?
No, you're good. Now you are.
Am I frozen again? Am I back? Okay, thank you to everyone who spoke up here tonight. We really appreciate the public comment. Thank you for your candid responses and in your recommendations. I look forward to the final report that we're going to produce. I agree the changes here, some will be quick, some will take months, some will take years, but I look forward to getting started. I mean, looking at my priorities, I'm always going to focus on equity, which involves community connections, transparency, and data is also vital. I agree with Trustee Amenta there. So I look forward to moving this process ahead. And I think that, as President Rosick said, this is something the community wants us to pursue and to pursue aggressively. So we want to move with some speed here. And I really look forward to finalizing this report and starting to get moving on this.
Thank you, Trustee Warren. I see Trustee Stokebrand still working on her audio, so I will move to Trustee Carpenter.
Thank you. I just have more of a comment, but I am excited to move forward and to figure out the actions that we can take from here. So getting that actionable list. I mean, there's a few things that feel like low-hanging fruit that we can start with that seem easy and can knock out of the park first. But the data piece, I think, is huge. The other thing that you mentioned, is really thinking about doing something different with community engagement. There's a variety of pieces. We used to live in a different city and some things that I personally found with the police there that was very interesting, in how that they engaged with the community where we lived. So I think that has it has a lot of, has an ability to go a long way. So I'm excited for us to move forward with the small steps and take the big ones as well. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna just make my, Rebecca, do you have a question or a comment quickly?
I just wanted to let you know that Trustee Stokebrand has called in. So just to clarify the audio thing, so you won't see her, but if she has comments.
Okay, Trustee Stokebrand, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead with
Thank
your
you.
second
I
part
would
of your
just, I'm sorry, I think Alex had a response to my question, and I don't want to waste everyone's time. I will go back and listen to the video tomorrow.
I didn't hear the second part of your, the second part of your question. Could you repeat that for me?
I guess it was, in a community that prioritizes walkability and bicycling, to cut back on, you know, we're getting money from the state free, right? So we want, in my view, we want patrolling of speeding, OWI, and seatbelts. This is basic traffic safety that in a community like this is important. But if we wanted to have those kinds of extra patrolling and take the money from the state for it, but there obviously, as I think Beth previously mentioned, we have concerns about, you know, racial disparity in that patrolling. How do we get both? How we get, you know, take care of what we see as racial disparity, but keep the patrolling for safety?
Well, I think, first of all, as I mentioned, the grant program has to be part of a comprehensive traffic safety program, right? It can't just be sitting out there by itself, where people just come in and do a couple hours of overtime and write a few tickets, right? That's not good. But the racial disproportionality is a different problem, right? I mean, at one point in our discussions during this, the chief suggested, well, maybe we should just stop doing traffic law enforcement. To me, that's the easy way out. You know, traffic law enforcement has a role in public safety, right? The question is we have to learn how to do it according to the Constitution, right? That's the key. And those two things, the idea is you can build the systems to ensure that policing is being provided according to the Constitution while meeting your strategic initiatives. But you have to have the initiatives, they have to be well-defined, you have to be data-driven, and you have to have the accountability systems in place to make sure that things are done well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Stokebrand. I'll just wrap up my comments, and then we'll take on the next agenda item if they're, depending on. So I would just ask that we work really hard as a board, and we get the resources and we allocate the resources needed in the next couple of months in order to work with our consultant or whomever the expert would be to develop a plan of action. There is so much good stuff in this report, and there's a lot of work to be done. And I just want to ensure that we continue the effort. And we have so much on our plate as a village board and so little time in our meetings that I want to make sure the ball doesn't get dropped, or it doesn't take an extraordinary amount of time between now and when we come up with an action plan. So just something to think about. I'm in full favor of and support of allocating additional resources, meaning monetary resources as well, if needed, to get the expert help that we will probably require to put together an action plan. So that's really where I'm at. Rebecca, on the agenda, can you just help me out here? It says presentation of the police report or the police organizational study. We did our questions and answers, and then is C next steps, just to report on the next steps?
Yes, and I'd be happy to help with that.
Go right ahead.
First, before we get there, I want to take the opportunity to thank the team that brought us here tonight. We had the village board supportive of taking forward this study. And then we also had a task force, which included our public safety chair, Trustee Stokebrand, HRC Chair Sharvita Parker, Police Chief Nimmer, and Lieutenant Liebenthal, and Assistant Manager Burkhart, who all worked hard to get the RFP together, go through these proposals, and spent a significant amount of time with Alexander Weiss, who I have to say, Alex, I have never met a consultant who has broadly opened their cell phone number up to everybody in the community for wanting to speak. Anyone who took the time to speak with you, you made yourself available. I want to thank you for all the time that you spent with Chief Nimmer and Lieutenant Liebenthal, who were critical in trying to get the information to you that you needed in order to perform this analysis. So thank you. As a next step in the process, Alexander's study is in a draft format right now. And we've done that because we want feedback from the community relative to that draft. And so it's going to stay in draft form, and the deadline for those, any additional comments, if you have some thoughts after this meeting that you'd like to share with him, that timeline is to get those in by December 4th. One critical piece that I know our village board has requested tonight, requested by Trustee Warren, was a prioritization of the list of recommendations. And so that's something that I think we're all going to look forward to reviewing when that draft comes back, or the final report gets issued to the board. So again, for the community, if you have additional comments or questions or comments with regards to the report, we want to hear from you about those by Friday, December 4th. Then Alex is going to take that feedback, and he is then going.
I'm sorry, Rebecca, who would they send them to if there's additional feedback?
Alex, I would recommend they send them directly to you.
Fine, yeah, great.
Okay.
And the email is posted.
We would welcome to, we will take an opportunity to get his information up on the website, as well as release it through different venues so people have that again, to make that clear. And then after just December 4th, you're going to take that information, and then you are going to make final modifications to the report, including the prioritization, and then provide it to the village board for receipt on December 21st.
21st?
Correct.
Good. Okay. Sounds good.
I just have one question before Trustee Menta. There was a question for Chief Nimmer. I don't know if, Rebecca, you were able to get a hold of him by cell for an answer, or if he's able to speak tonight.
I have not been able to, but I have recorded what the question is, and so we're happy to follow up.
Chief Nimmer, are you
here? I see him on this.
I'm here.
Hi, Chief. I believe there was just a question on who signs off for the state grant. I believe that was it. If someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but.
Sure. So the state grants that we have received, I believe we received them for at least probably the last 10 to 15 years. And the state grants are automatically given to the municipalities. And in our region, we are a part of a task force that is made up of the North Shore. And so that money comes directly to the North Shore Task Force and is distributed to the communities. And I think that's, an important piece. I think if the community would like to look at that as something that is a change, we would certainly look at that. And I just want to make an overall comment, and I just want to thank everybody that was involved in the process. I think, certainly, talking with the officers and certainly myself, we are certainly committed to working with the community and being as transparent as we possibly can. I think part of the issue was the data, trying to get the data out of Phoenix. As you probably are aware, we are a consolidated dispatch, and so we are at the mercy of 7 other departments and of the Bayside Dispatch Center to be able to get that information out of there. I think now that we've figured it out and we worked with Phoenix, over the course of the last couple of months, I think we're going to be better at that. Certainly Alex's recommendation of the traffic stop data collection form certainly is probably something that we would implement to be able to better get that information, be more readily available. I think some of the other things, you know, right now, currently on the website, we're posting every call for service each week. So everything our officers do is posted online. In addition to that, you'll notice our monthly reports are out there too, which also includes our use of force data and other relevant information. So we are certainly committed. I know, you know, I think a bigger, excuse me, and a deeper dive into some of those numbers, I think will help. And we're excited to work with the HRC in doing that. And so I think we'll look forward to, moving forward from here. And I'm confident that I think as we move forward, I think it's just a matter of communication to some extent. I know there was some information about, different groups and what their roles are. And I just think that there was a lot of misinformation, a lot of confusion and not understanding that, and then not necessarily having that communication. I think this has brought that communication out. I think it's important that the village board does set some priorities and what they want to see in their police department. I think that will go a long way. And I mean, I've always said from day one, this is the Shorewood Police Department, not my police department, not, Rebecca's police department. It's the Shorewood Police Department. And we're committed to that. And we certainly, in no way, shape, or form, in any manner, do I want anyone in the village of Shorewood or surrounding communities to feel that we aren't 100% committed to making sure that everyone that lives, works, comes, and visits is not feel that they cannot, or they feel that they would be targeted in any way or any bias in our police department. So certainly, obviously, some numbers there. We committed to give those numbers, and it is what it is, and we're willing to work moving forward to work on that. I think it's important. I mean, part of it is, the national rhetoric has been, a lot of fighting between, communities and the police. We just don't need that. I don't want that. There's no reason for that. I think it's important that both sides, if you want to call them sides, but we have to have open and honest conversations, and people have to be willing to listen on both sides. I'm willing to listen. We just have to have that information and have that discussion. So I know that's more than what you asked, but I felt after listening to some of this stuff, and there's other things like, we talked about assignments, follow-up, right? I just want to touch on that. And a lot of our officers do their own follow-up. So I don't want the impression to be that there's no follow-up on cases. They may not get assigned to the detective bureau, but our officers themselves follow up on those cases. So I just that was one thing that kind of stuck out. So again, I just want to thank everybody, and we look forward to moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief. We appreciate your comments. Trustee Menta, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to unmute. I think we need, what I'm looking for is more than just prioritization, because we already have about 50 things on a list that's prioritized, and things that we prioritize tend to kind of sit on the shelf. So what I'm looking for from the village administration is not just prioritization, but a plan for how we are going to take the next steps, how we are going to work through these issues and these questions. Are they going to be a public safety committee? Is the board going to be involved? Is the police commission? Is the HRC? What is our public involvement and engagement plan in this? How we're going to interact with the police chief and other people in the police department, because really this is not something that the board has been involved in or done in the past. So it's all kind of breaking new ground. And I think I do want to mention we still have a DPW study that we sort of received and have work to do in working through that study for that very important department too. But I think all of us kind of feel this is probably even a higher priority. But so it's not just what are the priorities, it's how are we going to address them as a board.
Thank you. I term that an action plan. So hopefully.
President Rozek?
Yes, Trustee.
when you're done. I have my hand raised, but I wasn't sure you could see it because I'm on my phone. So when you're done.
Oh, okay, sure. I just wanted to, that's what I think I meant by an action plan as well. What we need to develop a plan of action so that we know exactly who's responsible for what. I think that the chief hit it on the head with the communication, and maybe we didn't know the roles and what people were supposed to be doing. And that does come out of not having an action plan and a true understanding of the roles of the different organizations within the village. And so I think it'll go a long way. Hopefully, if we need more resources, as I said, that the board would support doing that in a quick fashion so we can come up with something. Go ahead, Trustee Stokbrand.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that I think I may have misspoken earlier. I found my Wisconsin League of Municipalities information about additional authority to the police and fire commissions. And I was thinking about the optional powers, which gets more into supervising the department with rules and regulations for control and management. Now that requires a referendum. And the other part it does is for more the business side of the department. But I think for oversight, I do think it is within the scope of our police commission. So I wanted to clarify that. The other thing I'd like to say is, as chair of the Public Safety Committee, I would welcome the opportunity. I believe Wesley is on the committee with me, and I will, if I could dare to speak for him, we would be welcome to taking this on with the Public Safety Committee and the staff. Our public safety committees would always be open to the public. And I don't think Trustee Bockhorst is also on the committee. I don't believe she's on the call, but we would welcome the opportunity to be the starting point for this discussion.
Thank you. Just to comment back, I do believe it should start at the village board. So the full village board be involved with that action plan, but I definitely, I appreciate Trustee Stokbrand's referral to committee, and that's probably, my guess is where it'll end up for implementing that action plan. Does anyone else have any comments from the board? No? Okay. Rebecca, go ahead. Was there anything else that we needed to advise on?
No, just I wanted to note that it happens to be at this time our Public Safety Committee. Trustee Warren is also our trustee liaison to the Human Relations Commission. So I think it's a really great blend. And I love tackling action plans. So I'm excited to work with you guys and the rest of the community and with the department. And I think that we're headed in a great direction.
Thank you so much. With that, I want to thank the consultant, thank all the public and our board members for tonight. The next time we'll discuss this, Rebecca, is?
We will receive the report on December 21st, and I'm going to be in follow-up with the board early next week with some additional communication for some possible discussion on December 7th as well.
On December 7th. Okay, that gives us a roadmap.
President Rosick, are you taking additional citizen comments?
Not at this time, but they are definitely welcome to submit them through email or call us or to Rebecca, who can distribute those. I would like to close out the meeting, and our next agenda item is motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. I have a motion by Trustee Amenta to adjourn and a second by Trustee Warren. Can you just take the roll since we are on Zoom?
Yes. Trustee Amenta.
Aye.
Trustee Carpenter.
Aye.
Trustee Ursing.
Aye.
Trustee Stokebrand.
Aye.
Trustee Warren.
Aye.
President Rosick.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, everybody have a great night. Thanks again.
Thank you.